The Osborne Internet-linked Encyclopedia of the Ancient World, starting at page 148. The First Greeks. Greece is a hot, dry country in the southern Europe with a craggy, mountainous landscape. Its long, jagged coastlines, peppered with bays and inlets, juts out into the Mediterranean Sea and is surrounded by hundreds of islands. Around 40,000 years ago, which we don't believe in, the first inhabitants started moving into the area. The Stone Age. The first Greeks lived in caves and used tools of bones and flint. They hunted bison and reindeer, which have long since died out in southern Europe, and gathered wild plants. This period is known as the Stone Age. The first farmers. Sometime before 6000 BC, farmers settled in eastern Greece. They grew wheat and vegetables, and they kept sheep. The landscape wasn't quite the same as it is now. It is much more wooded, and only good farming land was in narrow valleys and coastal plains, so people relied on fishing for extra food. The Bronze Age. Around 3000 BC, people in Greece discovered how to make bronze by mixing copper and tin. They used it to make tools and weapons that were hard and sharp. This made farming and building easier. This period, from around 3000 to 1100, is known as the Bronze Age. The first towns. As farming became more efficient, many farmers grew more food for their families and more food than they could eat. This extra food could be exchanged for other goods such as tools or pottery. Some people began to make a living as craftsmen, making objects instead of farming. The population increased and some villages grew into towns. The Cyclades. Archaeologists have identified a thriving culture on the Cyclade Islands from about 2600 to 2000 BC. Craftsmen there produced fine carvings, and there was active trade between the islands. But the Cyclades were too small for the way of life there to develop further. The Minoans. The first ever European civilization developed on Crete, the largest of the Greek islands. It began to flourish around the year 2000 BC, but mysteriously died out less than 1,000 years later. Its remains were first discovered in the 1920s by a British archaeologist, Sir Arthur Evans. He named it the Minoan civilization after a legendary king of Crete named Minos. Minoan life Minoan civilization was based around several large palaces, each of which was at the heart of a thriving local community with skilled craftsmen, artists, and professional writers known as scribes. The Minoans also had a highly organized economy and system of trade. Their goods have been found all over Greece, the Cyclades Islands, Egypt, and the eastern Mediterranean. Much of what we know about the Minoan way of life comes from frescoes, wall paintings. It appears that most people made their living from farming, but fished and hunted for extra food. We also know that men usually wore a loincloth and a short kilt made of wool or linen, while women wore bright dresses with frilled skirts. The legend of Minos. According to Greek legend, the god Zeus fell in love with a beautiful princess called Europa. Zeus turned himself into the shape of a bull and swam to Crete with her on his back. One of their three sons, Minos, became the king of Crete. Although Minos was the name of the king in the legend, scholars think Minos may have been a Cretan title for all kings, like the Egyptian word pharaoh. Minoan houses. At the heart of Minoan life was the palace, where the royal family lived. Courtiers and people who worked at the palace also lived there, but most people would have lived in houses outside the palace grounds. The storage and cooking areas were downstairs, with the living and sleeping areas above. Dating the evidence. Archaeologists sometimes use information from other cultures to help them date newly excavated sites. Minoan pots have been found in Egypt long before any major sites were found on Crete. So when similar pots were eventually discovered on Crete, experts were able to date them according to the Egyptian finds. Minoan palaces. Around 2000 BC, the Minoans built several large palaces, each with his own king and royal family. These remained the focus of their communities and their way of life until around 1700 BC. When disaster struck the island and the palaces were destroyed by a series of earthquakes, the Minoans remained undeterred, however, and built new, even grander palaces right on top of the ruins of the old ones. Knossos. The largest of the Minoan palaces was at Knossos, which was built and rebuilt several times. The walls were mainly stone, with wooden roofs, ceilings, and doors. The design of the palace was light and airy, with a good drainage system, and it was decorated with bull's horns, which appear to have been a Minoan religious symbol. At its height, over 30,000 people may have lived in Knossos and surrounding areas. Frescoes. Each palace had apartments set aside for its royal family. There was spacious rooms decorated with wall paintings known as frescoes, made by applying paint to wet plaster. The frescoes at Knossos have given archaeologists lots of valuable information about Minoan life. Most of the frescoes can see there today, however, are actually modern reconstructions. The king of Knossos may have had some authority over the rulers of the other palaces and played an important part in the religious life of the whole island. He had a number of state apartments, including a throne room where state business and religious ceremonies took place. As a form of tax, the king retained part of the annual grain harvest, which was stored at the palace. A portion of it was used to feed the people who lived there and to pay officials and craftsmen. The rest was exported around the Mediterranean, and the profits were used to pay for imports from other countries such as precious metals, jewels, ostrich feathers, ivory, and amber. Minoan scripts. The Minoans developed writing systems to help them keep records for trading purposes. The first, from 2000 BC, was a form of hieroglyphic picture writing. From 1900 BC, they began using a script which we call Linear A. So far, however, no one has been able to decipher either of the scripts. Minoan religion. Although there is no written records of the Minoans' religious beliefs, we know certain things from their paintings, pots, and statues. Sacred symbols. There appear to have been two main sacred symbols, one of the bull, sacred to the sea god. Images of its horns were found all over Knossos. The other sacred symbol was a double-headed weapon known as the labrys. Both of these were used to decorate pots and tombs as well as palaces. Religious ceremonies. Religious ceremonies were led by priests and priestesses while musicians played. Rooms were set aside for worship in the palaces, but the Minoans also used outdoor shrines in caves and on mountaintops. It seems likely that goddesses and priestesses were more important than gods and priests. We know this because females are shown more prominently in religious statues and paintings. The Minoans appear to have had a daring custom, which involved leaping over a bull. From images on Minoan paintings, it seemed that teams of men and women took turns to approach a charging bull. They grasped its horns and catapulted themselves onto its back, and then onto the ground. This dangerous sport may have been a religious ritual, as the bull was a sacred animal. It probably took place in the courtyard at the palace. The Minoans believed in life after death. They buried their dead with food and possessions for use in the afterlife. In early times, the rich were buried in stone tombs with their other bodies. Later on, they were buried in individual coffins. The legend of the Minotaur. According to the legend, an Athenian prince named Theseus sailed to Crete, where he fought and overpowered a terrible monster, known as the Minotaur. The monster was half man, half bull, and was kept in a labyrinth, an underground maze. This tale may be based partly on fact. The palace at Knossos was so maze-like that it could be described as a labyrinth. The king may also have worn a bull's mask in religious ceremonies, linking him to the idea of a minotaur. Explosions and invasions. Around 1600 BC, the once golden age of Minoan culture went into decline. Although we don't know exactly why this happened, it seems that Crete suffered a series of natural disasters which must have contributed. Thera explodes. Scientists have discovered that around 1450 BC, the nearby island of Thera was blasted to pieces by massive volcanic eruption. At about the same time, the palaces on Crete were destroyed. The cause may have been tidal waves and earth tremors created by the eruption. But whatever the reason, the whole Minoan way of life was thrown into chaos. After the Thera eruption, the Minoans seem to have reoccupied their palaces for a time, until around 1350 BC, when most of the palaces and villas were destroyed for good, this time by fire. We don't know what caused this, but it is likely that Crete was invaded by the Mycenaeans from mainland Greece, who overthrew the Minoans and took control of the island, destroying the Minoan culture in the process. Knossos became the focus of Mycenaean society on Crete, but around 1100 BC it was burned down and never rebuilt. No one knows what caused the fire, but it could have been the result of a violent confrontation between Mycenaean and Minoans, or between different Mycenaean groups. In the 1960s, Greek archaeologists Spyridon Marinatos and Christos Dumas started excavations on Thera. They unearthed the remains of a Minoan village at Akrotiri, which had been completely buried in volcanic ash. Houses, frescoes, and pottery were all preserved, revealing a great deal how Minoan people lived their lives. The legend of Atlantis. According to the Greek philosopher Plato, there was once a thriving civilization on an island named Atlantis, which had sunk beneath the ocean without a trace. Over the centuries, many people have been captivated by the legend, with some suggesting that the eruption and the departure of the Minoans might be the source of this story. The Mycenaeans. From about 1600 BC, mainland Greece was dominated by the people we call the Mycenaeans. They are named after the city of Mycenae, where evidence of their culture was first discovered. Who were they? The Mycenaeans lived in small kingdoms, each based around a separate city. These kingdoms were never united, but traded together and shared a language and way of life. Mycenae itself was probably the leading city. Historians are not sure where the Mycenaeans came from. They may have come from Greece, from Central Europe around 2000 BC, or may have already been in Greece for some time before that. Where did they live? Most Mycenaeans lived in walled cities, which were built on high ground to make them easy to defend. The important buildings were situated in the Acropolis, meaning high city in Greek. On top of the hill, most people lived in the lower town outside the walls of the Acropolis. The Acropolis at Mycenae was similar to those of other ancient cities. Inside the walls was the royal palace and houses for courtiers, soldiers, and craftsmen. The main gateway was decorated with two lions, possibly symbols of the royal family. Food and trade. As in Crete, the palace was at the heart of the island's economic life. Craftsmen, goods, and produce from farming were stored in the Acropolis for distribution around Crete or export. Mycenaean palace life. The royal palace at Mycenae was made up of several brightly painted buildings, often with more than one floor, arranged around a vast central courtyard. A Mycenaean palace was far more than just a royal residence. It was military headquarters, an administrative base, and a workplace for craftsmen. Palace life revolved around a large hall called a megaron, where the king held his court and conducted state business. Mycenaean script. The Mycenaeans adapted Minoan form of writing to devise their own script, which we call Linear B. Archaeologists have unearthed thousands of Linear B tablets, which they have been able to decipher because the Mycenaeans spoke an early form of Greek. The results have not been that exciting, though, as the tablets mainly contain lists of livestock, farming produce, craft items, as well as details of palace officials and their tasks.